Pokemon should not work, at least not as a competitive game. There are over 1,000 different characters, an incredibly complex type chart that makes rock, paper, scissors look like rock, 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 and unique centralizing mechanics added every 3 years. It's a game that anyone can see has no business working competitively. There's too many variables, there's just too much going on. It shouldn't be possible that it works. And yet, it does. And the single biggest factor in allowing Pokemon to actually operate as a competitive game has to do with a single move. Not something flashy like Gigantamax Wildfire or Batty Bad, but a move that doesn't even do any damage. A move that is nearly worthless during a traditional playthrough of the game. A move that someone new to competitive Pokemon would certainly glance right over. Protect is a very simple move. During this turn, the user doesn't take any damage. It can't be used successively without risking a high chance of failure, and nearly every Pokemon in the game learns it. It isn't fancy, but it is the bedrock of competitive Pokemon. Thanks to Protect, the game is able to center around positioning and preservation. Because competitive Pokemon is entirely double battles, being able to keep your Pokemon safe while your partner takes out a threat, or you switch out to gain a better matchup or more support, is the only reason this game works at all. Without Protect, competitive Pokemon would center entirely around whose offense could blow through the other person's first. And games would be decided nearly instantaneously based on who had a better turn one. Because Protect is the foundation of competitive Pokemon, getting around it is really tricky. You can commit to using Feint, a super weak move that can break Protect, but it will do next to nothing if the opponent doesn't go for it, and it also requires your partner to actually be the one doing the damage. You could use Imprison, which can stop opponents from using Protect, but it takes a turn, 2 of your own Pokemon's moves, and it isn't even given to that many Pokemon in the first place. There's a couple other, even more niche moves that can get around it, but you probably get the picture. To get around Protect, you need to invest a ton of resources, and even then, it'll be inconsistent at best. Or, hear me out, you can pay $30. Our tragic tale begins all the way back in Sword and Shield. After a massive release of the franchise's first ever mainline game on a home console, Pokemon had a decision to make. It was clear that the model of releasing a sequel game was no longer working after the disaster that was Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, but bonus content added onto the main game of the generation was still a good way to make money and hold fans over until the next generation. The solution Pokemon came up with was the modern idea of paid DLC. There would be 2 of these, and the first one, the Isle of Armor, added a new sub-region to explore and introduced several new Pokemon. One of those additions changed competitive Pokemon in a way we literally could not see coming. The Isle of Armor's exclusive legendary Pokemon was called Urshifu, and it had the brand new ability Unseen Fist, which allows any attack it uses that makes contact to bypass Protect and its counterparts like Spiky Shield, Obstruct, Detect, Baneful Bunker, King Shield, and Silk Trap. Wait, what is Silk Trap? Oh, it's Spidops' signature move. That's probably why I didn't know what it was. Now, this isn't the first time that Pokemon has experimented with allowing moves to hit through Protect. The first time was 7 years ago with the release of Sun and Moon and their unique Z move mechanic. These once per battle super powerful moves would still do damage through Protect, though it was only a quarter of what they would have done otherwise. The same concept was used once more with the introduction of Dynamax in Sword and Shield, where Dynamax Pokemon's moves would turn into super powerful max moves. Just like Z moves, using a max move into Protect resulted in a quarter of the damage going through. Importantly, while these moves could bypass Protect, it's clear that Pokemon realized just how dangerous this was, so they built in several checks to these mechanics. Only doing a quarter of your damage is a massive deal, as is the fact that these powerful moves can't be used recklessly. Z moves could only be used once per battle, so you really didn't want to use them in front of Protect. And while Dynamax lasted for 3 turns, each of these moves was weaker than their Z move counterpart, and max moves could be blocked completely with Max Guard, the Dynamax equivalent of Protect. Add on to this the doubled HP pool of Dynamax Pokemon, and you'll see that while each of these mechanics were very powerful, they didn't break the game because they still allowed Protect to do its job. So, it's clear that Pokemon understands how precarious the game really is, and the proverbial duct tape holding it all together is a beautiful little move that lets your monsters chill out for a single turn. So you might imagine that Urshifu, a Pokemon that can hit through Protect, would have similar limitations to the other ways of bypassing Protect, right? 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 For some reason, Game Freak decided that they should throw out the entire basis holding competitive Pokemon together, and that Urshifu would do 100% of its damage when hitting through Protect. No drawback, no downsides, just 100% pure bare fist in your Spidop's face. The single restriction placed on Urshifu is that the only moves it can use that go through Protect are moves that make physical contact with the opponent. Thankfully for the worst bear of all time, all of the relevant moves it likes to use make physical contact. Effectively, this restriction is like taking a kid to a dollar store and saying, hey, don't spend more than, I don't know, 100,000 bucks. It's not doing a whole lot. Of course, an ability alone does not make a Pokemon great. There are several Pokemon with absurd abilities, but they're balanced out by other factors to make sure they don't take over the game. Giving Unseen Fist to a Pokemon like, I don't know, Spidops, for example, wouldn't make any impact on the game except to give YouTubers some extra content. But Unseen Fist isn't exclusive to a Pokemon that even other bug types are embarrassed to share the same patch of grass with. Unseen Fist was given to Urshifu and Urshifu only, who is not only one of the single strongest Pokemon introduced in all of Sword and Shield, but it's also a Pokemon with 2 forms, making it twice as versatile. Now, sometimes Pokemon having different forms doesn't really change anything. There are a ton of Pokemon with forms that are purely aesthetic, and even when there are differences between forms, oftentimes there's either a clear best option, like with Basculesian, who has different stats depending on gender, or the 2 forms are similar enough that the differences are minor, like with Tatsugiri. Urshifu is the rare case where, although each of its forms are unbelievably broken, they're also distinct enough that it does really function as 2 different Pokemon. Both Urshifu forms share the same stats and mostly the same move pool. Where they differ is their signature move and their typing. Urshifu Rapid Strike is a water and fighting type, whereas Urshifu Single Strike is a dark and fighting type. Their signature moves are extremely powerful attacks, called Surging Strikes and Wicked Blow, respectively. These are high base power moves that always result in a critical hit, and Surging Strikes actually hits 3 times. To make matters worse, you can't tell which Urshifu form it is at Team Preview. A huge tournament was actually won during Sword and Shield with 5 water types and Urshifu Dark. Opponents unlucky enough to go up against this team simply assumed it was Urshifu Water and were then caught off guard. You might notice that none of these things that we're talking about are exclusive to Scarlet and Violet. In fact, Urshifu Single Strike received a slight nerf on its signature move in these games, and the team preview issue is less of a problem for live events now that we use team sheets detailing each player's team before the battle. So why am I making this video now and not when Urshifu was introduced 3 years ago? When Urshifu was released, the premier gimmick of the region it was born into was Dynamax. With Dynamax, once per game, any Pokemon on your team could inflate itself into a Kaiju for 3 turns, gaining double its health and access to those stronger max moves we were talking about earlier that also had secondary effects activating stat boosts or changing effects on the field. Any non-damaging moves would be converted into Max Guard, which was just a super protect that could even block max moves. Crucially, Max Guard could block other moves, including ones affected by Urshifu's Unseen Fist. For the first ever DLC in Pokemon history, it was kind of a no-brainer that Game Freak made the Pokemon you'd be paying for pretty strong, even strong enough to exist and thrive in a format with Dynamax threats. But given how overpowered Urshifu was, it was a relief that they didn't forget to give it counterplay. With Max Guard, trainers at least had some type of defense against Urshifu, and even though Max Guard wasn't always a great use of your 3 turns of Dynamax, the doubled HP pool of Dynamax Pokemon made Urshifu getting attacks off much less of an issue. With a mechanic like Dynamax being so integral to the game, the existence of Urshifu still isn't justifiable, but it was at least manageable. Let's fast forward to Generation 9. Terastallization is the new mechanic. Once a battle, a Pokemon on your team can change their type. In my opinion, this is a much more flexible and dynamic addition to the game than Dynamax, but a problem lurks on the horizon for our Crystal competitors. Pokemon Home's release sneaks up all too quickly, and to every VGC player in the world's surprise, Urshifu is legal again. And this time, Dynamax isn't here to save us. But the sponsor of today's video might be able to save you. especially if you haven't got a gift for your loved ones for Valentine's Day yet. Holzkern is a regular sponsor of videos on this channel, and it's one of my favorites. They create unique watches and jewelry that feature FSC certified wood and other natural materials. I really love watches, and I wear one that Holzkern sent me almost every single day. This one's my current go-to. I really like how the dark wood looks against the brighter metal. This year, I got my loved ones Holzkern watches as gifts, and I'm sure they'll be a hit. Holzkern has over 1,000 products to choose from. I actually was a little overwhelmed when I first looked at their website because of all the options. The good news is, because of all the different choices, I'm sure you'll be able to find something you love. And if you're purchasing something from Holzkern as a gift for a loved one, there's guaranteed delivery before Valentine's Day as long as you place your order by February 11th. Go to holzkern.com/WolfeyVGC and use code Wolfey15 for 15% off your order. Thanks again to Holzkern for sponsoring this video. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that Max Guard or even Dynamax as a whole was the only counter to Urshifu. The strategies we have available now to counter it, though, are a little bit limited. By far, the more popular Urshifu form is Rapid Strike, largely due to its signature move, Surging Strikes. Surging Strikes has two characteristics that all but guarantee that when it's directed into the correct slot, it's taking a KO. First, it will always critical hit. This is true of Wicked Blow as well. Critical hits do three things. They do 50% more damage, they ignore any defense boosts on the Pokemon getting crit and any offensive drops on the Pokemon doing the critting, and finally, they make people who need therapy punch holes in their computer. The important thing to take away from this is stat reduction tactics like Intimidate or Charm won't save you. Now, we've seen this always crit mechanic implemented with almost no issues on Paldea's fully evolved and fully bipedal Grass starter, Meowscarada's signature move, Flower Trick. But Flower Trick is meaningfully weaker than Surging Strikes, and Meowscarada is much weaker than Urshifu. Also, Grass-type attacks have 5 resistances, whereas Water only has 3. Also, and this is just like a really tiny minor thing, Meowscarada can't hit through Protect. Second thing that makes Surging Strikes broken is that it hits 3 times. Not only does this mean that defensive options like the item Focus Sash and the ability Sturdy don't work against it, but it also makes the animation take longer, which is especially tilting when playing against Urshifu. Each hit does 25 damage or 37.5 with the crit, totaling to 112 base power. Keep in mind that typically all moves with 100 base power or higher are given a meaningful drawback. Whether that's imperfect accuracy or recoil, the stronger a move is, the more significant the cost of using it. In Urshifu's case, they created a move well over this threshold that, rather than having a drawback, instead has the advantage of always critting. Surging Strikes' water typing has a hidden extra benefit, in that it can be powered up by 50% in the rain. Urshifu's threatening enough even without rain being active. In the rain, even Pokemon that resist Surging Strikes can't switch in safely. Between the sheer power of the Pokemon and the removal of consistent counterplay once again, since you can't protect in front of it, you can see why this Pokemon might be considered a problem. The reason I wanted to make this video is because Urshifu is the only Pokemon that's broken to come out of Sword and Shield. Good thing these games didn't add any other horrifying, overpowered, stupidly broken Pokemon, right? Okay, so obviously a lot of the Pokemon that were added during Sword and Shield are really strong. So why are we talking about Urshifu specifically? I don't think that many people would try and argue that Urshifu is stronger than Zacian, and you could probably even make a case that it's not as strong as something like Fluttermane, though I don't know how many people would agree with you. The thing is, strength isn't what we're talking about here. Urshifu completely breaks competitive Pokemon in a way that is completely unique to any other Pokemon. The problem with Urshifu is that it operates outside the rules of the game. It's kind of like if in Chess 2, they added a knight who could move 2 turns in a row. Maybe it wouldn't have as much raw strength as something like your queen, but it would still completely warp the game around it. Competitive Pokemon is entirely balanced around Protect, and having a Pokemon that ignores Protect with no drawback, and having that Pokemon be incredibly strong on its own, it totally breaks the game. Now, typically when a physical Pokemon is dominating the metagame, Reflect and Intimidate crop up to slow them down. But thanks to its signature move always critting, this doesn't work against Urshifu. Pokemon with water resistances can still be KO'd in 2 hits if Urshifu is boosted in some way with a Terra or in the rain. Outspeeding Urshifu is extremely difficult when it can run a Choice Scarf or be paired with Tornadus, and some players even opt to do both. And if you can't outspeed Urshifu and you can't protect in front of it, your only remaining option is to simply take the damage. Even using Psychic, Flying, and Fairy type attacks isn't that effective, as Urshifu Rapid Strike will often run Terra Water, eliminating over half of its weaknesses and boosting its damage output further. Of the 6 major events that have happened since Urshifu was added to Scarlet and Violet, it has won 5 of them. The only one it didn't win, it finished 2nd. This isn't necessarily a feature of raw strength. Rather, even teams with specific Urshifu counterplay can't stop it. As an example, Gastrodon was something that many players considered going into this year's World Championship. With its Storm Drain ability, it's not only immune to all water moves, but it forces them to target Gastrodon, making it one of the best answers to Urshifu on paper in the game. You would think that with Gastrodon in the format, a Pokemon good enough to have won World Championships even before Urshifu was introduced, that we would have a reliable counter if somebody wanted one, right? But even the world's most slippery slug can't do anything to Urshifu. Close combat still hits incredibly hard, and even if you found a way around close combat, Gastrodon still couldn't reliably stop Urshifu. The thing is, while Gastrodon has an amazing matchup versus Urshifu, it's not well positioned versus a lot of the other top Pokemon. In competitive Pokemon, players select 4 of their 6 Pokemon each battle, leaving 2 behind. So players using Urshifu aren't even forced to bring it versus Gastrodon if they don't want to. Slug players, on the other hand, have to play a super dangerous game of chicken. Should they bring Gastrodon, knowing that they'll likely be at a disadvantage if the opponent doesn't bring Urshifu? Or should they instead bluff and leave it behind, exposing themselves to an Urshifu sweep? All of the power here is in the hands of the Urshifu player, in a matchup that in theory they should be heavily disadvantaged. This isn't just a Gastrodon problem either. Amoonguss is a Pokemon that on paper destroys Urshifu. With its great natural bulk, recovery via its Regenerator ability, grass typing, ability to redirect attacks with Rage Powder, and access to Spore, it seems like a great flexible Pokemon that is capable of stopping Urshifu. Even more so when you add on the Rocky Helmet, an item that does damage every time the holder is hit with a contact move, which is especially effective against the 3 hits of Surging Strikes. But even with all of this, it isn't enough to be a consistent answer to Urshifu. The world's winning Urshifu, for example, ran Taunt, a move that decimates Amoonguss, and other players have had success with things such as Safety Goggles Urshifu, allowing them to completely ignore Amoonguss and actually turn it into a liability. For pretty much every possible counter you can think of, the Urshifu players have a response. It's worth noting that in the current format, we're mostly talking about Urshifu Water. While Urshifu Dark is still powerful, its typing is worse both offensively and defensively, and it really struggles against Iron Hands, who not only resists its powerful Wicked Blow, but can also hit it for super effective damage and heal back up. Urshifu Dark having at least one actual counter right now makes it much more manageable than its slippery sibling. So, Urshifu is a Pokemon that not only fundamentally breaks the game via its ability that operates outside the rules of competitive Pokemon, but it's also got no drawbacks to any of its absurd strengths, a ton of flexibility with how it can be played, and virtually no consistent counters. Unfortunately, we haven't finished talking about its strengths. Some Pokemon are extremely powerful, but require very specific support in order to bring out their full potential. Torkoal, for example, can take out entire teams on its own, but it requires Trick Room to be used most effectively. Urshifu, however, doesn't need any one type of support, but benefits immensely from lots of the top Pokemon in the format. One of the most obvious pairings is Urshifu and Tornadus. With Tornadus' Prankster ability, it's able to set Tailwind up before any other Pokemon moves, immediately doubling the speed of your team. It can also use Rain Dance to boost Urshifu's power significantly, and Bleak Wind Storm to hit the grass types that resist Surging Strikes. Urshifu, when paired with Tornadus, can hold an item to do more damage, such as Mystic Water, or it can hold a Choice Scarf to allow it to beat other Tailwind-centric teams. Urshifu also pairs incredibly well with the new Pokemon Chen Pao. Thanks to its Sword of Ruin ability, when it's on the field, all other Pokemon take more damage from physical moves. Giving Urshifu an additional damage boost when it's already so strong is terrifying. Not to mention the fact that Chen Pao's high speed and access to priority moves allows it to combo with Urshifu easily, often KOing a Pokemon before they can move. This is a good time to bring up the fact that because Urshifu hits through Protect, players are just way less likely to click Protect in front of Urshifu in general. In other words, Urshifu allows your partner Pokemon to kind of gain its ability as a side benefit. For offensive teams with strong and fast Pokemon, this increases the amount of pressure they put on immensely. Not that you need to lean into offense to support Urshifu. There are several support Pokemon that pair very well with it, two of whom were used this year to win the World Championships. Iron Hands is a great partner for Urshifu because despite sharing a fighting typing, Iron Hands has access to the move Fake Out. This stops the target from moving, but only works the first turn after Iron Hands has switched in. Normally, one of the best ways to deal with Fake Out pressure is to just protect with both of your Pokemon, but in front of Urshifu, that doesn't work, obviously. And Iron Hands isn't the only Fake Out user around. Rillaboom is an incredibly popular Grass-type Pokemon that pairs well with Urshifu for similar reasons as Iron Hands, providing Fake Out pressure and a lot of bulk. Both Rillaboom and Iron Hands are good as well because they can hit the Water-type Pokemon for super effective damage that resist Urshifu's surging strikes. Speaking of Grass types, the other world-winning Urshifu support Pokemon was Amoonguss. Amoonguss is one of the best support Pokemon ever, redirecting attacks with Rage Powder, healing its partner with Pollen Puff, and disabling opponents with Spore. Most teams only have one or two Pokemon that are immune to Spore, so if Amoonguss hits the field at a time when you aren't able to knock it out, the typical play is to protect and switch in an immunity to Sleep. This strategy is not the best one in front of Urshifu, meaning on top of keeping Urshifu safe and healthy, Amoonguss can help to put opponents in a lose-lose situation, where they're forced to either take a powerful Surging Strikes or a Spore. There's lots more Pokemon that pair well with Urshifu, but by highlighting how some of the strongest Pokemon in the format, independent of Urshifu, also enable it to be even more menacing, I think you get the gist. It is worth noting that there is counterplay to Urshifu. I wouldn't say that these are hard counters, as in add this Pokemon to your team and you'll never have to worry about Urshifu, but instead that it is possible for teams without Urshifu to beat teams with it. The best thing you can do to make sure you don't get run over by the bear is to move before it attacks. Using things like Tailwind, Trick Room, and certain speed booster Pokemon like Fluttermane and Roaring Moon are effective at letting you move before it. At my most recent tournament, I ran Speed Booster Terra Grass Energy Ball Fluttermane, allowing me to outspeed and KO even Choice Scarf Urshifu, for example. If you can't outspeed it, you can at least hope to trade favorably with it. If you have two Pokemon on the field that are bulky enough and can threaten enough damage, such as Iron Hands and Rillaboom, you can force the Urshifu player to double into one of your Pokemon if they want to take it out, and attack with both of your own Pokemon in return into Urshifu to try and force a trade. Of course, if they protect, you can be out of luck, but many Urshifu hold the Choice Scarf item, making them harder to keep safe. Fake Out is a great move against Urshifu in general because it allows you to reposition without taking a big attack, kind of like a pseudo protect in this case. It helps that, like I mentioned, two of the best Fake Out users do match up pretty well against Urshifu. An offensive Grassy Glide user like a Rillaboom with a way to boost its damage, or an Ogerpon when paired with Rillaboom, is a new way to outspeed and KO Urshifu, though Intimidate can render this tactic less effective. Rocky Helmet is a great item against Urshifu, though it should never be your sole answer for it. Oftentimes, it can be used for meaningful chip against Urshifu, or to discourage Urshifu from attacking one of your Pokemon in the first place, which can be especially helpful on Pokemon that provide speed control like Tornadus and Farigiraf. There are some other tricks you can use to make Urshifu's life a little harder, but for the most part, this is how Urshifu needs to be stopped. Not with a single Pokemon, but with a collection of tools that each make its life harder on their own. This is very difficult to pull off. I mean, even with players doing their utmost to stop Urshifu, it continues to win tournaments. I was personally very hopeful that Ogerpon Water might be the hard counter to Urshifu we so desperately need, but Choice Scarf Urshifu just outspeeds it and uses U-turn into it every time it hits the field, eventually whittling it down to where it can't do its job anymore. So now you know all there is to know about Urshifu, and I think that means it's time to answer our question: Is Urshifu ruining competitive Pokemon? I think the answer is complicated. First of all, competitive Pokemon is not ruin. Even now, when there's a Pokemon dominating competitive play that's nearly impossible to stop, players are finding clever innovations and creative Pokemon that can work. Tournament attendance is the highest it's ever been for this part of a generation, and players are still having fun with the game. But I think the game would be much better without Urshifu. Just because it's still going well now, that doesn't mean that Urshifu's presence is anything other than a huge net negative on the game. Having a Pokemon that breaks the rules of the game also be so powerful, at the end of the day, just isn't fun. And the severely limited counterplay is the final nail in the coffin.